Good morning, everyone. As we begin our spring semester, we look forward to sharing conversations with faculty and colleagues from across our Georgetown community. And we begin this morning with E.J. Dionne, University Professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture in our Department of Government and our McCourt School of Public Policy. Professor, journalist, author, or editor of more than 10 books on American politics and political sentiment, including 8 New York Times bestsellers, and a frequent commentator and analyst on national politics. We're so glad to have EJ with us. He's been a columnist for the Washington Post for nearly 30 years, and he joined our Georgetown community nearly 2 decades ago. So EJ, thank you for taking the time to be with us for this conversation. And I'd like to start by asking you about this past week. We witnessed an historic Inauguration Day, the swearing in of our nation's second Catholic president, our first woman vice president, the first person of Black and South Asian descent. This year's inauguration was also very different in several ways. It followed a very divisive and challenging moment for our civic and political life amidst an ongoing pandemic. In your most recent Washington Post column, you offered your perspectives on this moment and highlighted some of the ideals captured in the president's inaugural address. Could you describe your insights for us? Offer us a sense of how you're thinking about this moment in American history and politics.
Well, Jack, it's a joy to be with you always and to be with our colleagues and friends out there. This was an extraordinary week, and I want to begin in a way with the challenge and the sadness of the week before I get to what I think in the end was the triumph of the week. And you probably had this experience too. Mary, my wife, and I got in a car and wandered around the Capitol on the Saturday before. And it was chilling to be in the city, in a city that was blocked off everywhere, where young men and young women in the military were there with automatic weapons. As a journalist many years ago, I covered the Civil War in Beirut, and I never thought I would be around Washington, D.C. and have it bring back memories of Beirut. Fortunately, without the shelling and without some of what was going on there, but nonetheless, it was the strangest time I'd ever seen in Washington. I mean, we had, I suppose you have to go back to the riots of the 1960s really to feel a moment like that in the streets. And so there was a kind of somberness to the city that you normally didn't see at inauguration time, which is usually a time of, excitement, of partying, people coming in from all over the country. That wasn't possible now, partly because of the pandemic. And so it promised to be a very different kind of week. But in the end, we triumphed in a number of ways as a country. First, the electoral process itself, the democratic process itself came under challenge, violent challenge, and it survived. The event itself was held, and it was held outside. It was held in the usual place where it was supposed to be held, despite security fears. They did, obviously, the Secret Service and others did a great job of protecting the president and vice president, everyone there. And then there was this very moving speech by Joe Biden, whom, as you point out, is only the second Catholic president of the United States, is very open about his Catholicism. There was service at St. Matthew's Church. He sort of does God love you as a normal part of his conversation. You feel like Joe Biden is the kind of guy who could have coached a CYO team in your parish or passed the basket at the 11 o'clock mass. He's that kind of old-fashioned Catholic, very much a sort of Vatican II and John F. Kennedy period Catholic. That was formative to him. And he gave a really powerful inaugural address that I must say I found was more powerful the more I went back to it, because I realized the elements he was pulling together. Because a lot of people were talking about it primarily as a call to national unity, which it was very powerfully, but it was unity of a particular kind. He was saying that, to achieve unity in a democracy, we need to put aside certain forces that divide us. And he called out white supremacy and racial injustice, and he called out lying, which I thought was very important. We must always defend the truth, he said. And so it was basically saying we ought to be able to have reasonable disagreements with each other, reasonable arguments with each other. That's what democracy is all about. We don't all agree on everything. But we need certain standards. We need to hold ourselves to certain standards in how we talk about politics, and above all, how we treat each other. The word that I appreciated that he used there, and that he's used a lot, and that I think goes to the heart of Catholic social thought, is dignity. The equal dignity, if Catholic social thought is not about the equal dignity of every person, it's not about anything at all. And it is that. And I think whatever anyone wants to say about Joe Biden, I think that is a driving idea and commitment in his life. And I think we're going to see that through his term.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, you bring an important perspective on religion and the role that it plays in shaping American politics. Are there particular insights that come to mind for you in this moment when we think about religion in public life and the presidency of Joe Biden?
Well, I think one of the things we've learned really through the centuries, but with great sharpness in recent years, is that religion has an enormous capacity to be a unifying force, an enormous capacity to be a deeply divisive force. We have, I fear, in recent years, seen the divisive side more than we have seen the unifying side. We saw it in our own Catholic Church, where there was great division among bishops, among lay people about the Trump years, about this election. We've seen it more broadly in our politics, where even within the Christian tradition itself, radically different understandings of what Christianity and the scriptures call us to. What kind of attitudes do they call us to? What kind of behavior do they call us to? And I would like to think that the defeat of President Trump and the fact that Biden is trying so hard to preach a certain kind of unity, that it might call us a bit, on all of us, a bit to reflect on how we could rediscover that aspect of Christianity in particular, but our religious traditions generally, that have a capacity to bring us together. One of the most important pieces of work I got to do this year was a report with my friend Melissa Rogers, who was the director of the faith-based office under President Obama in his second term. It was a report we called A Time to Heal, A Time to Build. And it was reflecting on the role of religion in public life, the role of civil society institutions, including very much faith-based institutions, in solving problems, and often in partnering with government to solve problems, to lift up the poor, and obviously in education, healthcare, a whole series of areas. And one of our hopes in that report was to take a term that has been deeply politicized and try to depoliticize it in the bad sense of politicized, which is the term religious liberty. Religious liberty is a term that ought to bring us together. One of the proudest achievements of our country is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment has two parts, and one part is about the non-establishment of religion, and the other part is about the free exercise of religion. And rather than seeing those two working in tandem, we have often had divisions in our politics where one side stressed non-establishment and the other so stressed free exercise that it could impinge on non-establishment, vice versa. So we wrote this report in part to lay out some very specific things about partnerships, about religion's role in sort of informing our foreign policy, how an understanding of religion can inform our foreign policy, but also how government might take steps to reduce conflict around the First Amendment and give religious liberty a meaning that can reach everyone, including people who have no faith at all. And just to close on one point, I think one of the things that all of us as Americans have to come to terms with is the biggest change sociologically in our country are the rise of the religious nuns, spelled not the way you and I grew up spelling nun, but spelled Nones, as particularly among young people. And that we are a deeply pluralistic country. I think it's great that one of President Biden's first moves was to end the Muslim ban, which was something we recommended in our report. But it also means understanding that when we talk about religion in public, we have to recognize secular people, and that secular people need to respect the role that religious people play, but it's got to work the other way around as well.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'd like to turn a little bit about your background and your work as a journalist. You've been named one of the 25 most influential journalists in Washington, D.C. Could you share with us a few reflections on your career in journalism and how you approach your work?
Well, I've been very fortunate to have a lot of interesting jobs in journalism over the years. I got to cover the Vatican under Pope John Paul II. It was join the Pope and see the world. And I persuaded the New York Times, God bless them, to let me take all of John Paul's trips around the world. And it was a very interesting period in the church because it was a period of great contest, both over Marxism and liberation theology and over sexuality and the church's teachings about sexuality. And I got to sort of cover this period. I've gotten to cover a lot of presidential campaigns going back, actually, as a young journalist, to some degree, 76 and 80, but pretty as a sort of either a full-time political reporter or a columnist, all the campaigns since 1988, which gave me a chance to visit the whole country. I think one of the best things about getting to be a political reporter in a campaign is to discover this extraordinary country we live in, to talk to people about their aspirations. Campaigns are a time when lots of citizens of all kinds reflect on who they are, on what kind of country they want. And so while my travels have given me a particularly large amount of time in Iowa and New Hampshire, two places I've come to love, they really gave me an optic on the country as a whole. And then there were all kinds of other experiences I got to have, from the kind of the fun to almost the tragic. I mentioned that I got to cover the war in Lebanon, which was, a tragic and experience where you saw the extraordinary resiliency of people under fire, literally, but you also saw where human beings could go. At the same time, I got to cover things like the Cannes and Venice film festivals. I even, talk about a misassignment, got to write a profile of Yves Saint Laurent and got to go to the Paris fashion shows. That was the largest learning curve I had to go through. So I think the great thing about journalism is you are forced to learn a lot about a lot of things. And you have an excuse to ask anyone in the world any question you want. I'll just close my answer with this. My late mom had over her piano a picture of my asking Pope John Paul a question, and with a half smile on his face, his finger was wagging, looking like he was reprimanding this former altar boy. So it's been a lot of fun and incredibly instructive, and how you can learn from everybody on God's earth is the main lesson I took from it.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, among several books, you're the author of the National Book Award nominee, Why Americans Hate Politics. You're also a co-author of the 2017 bestseller, One Nation After Trump. As we think about the past year, what sorts of topics or ideas have you explored in your writing that can help us to more deeply understand this moment?
Well, I'm grateful you mentioned Why Americans Hate Politics, because an argument I made, and that book was published in 1991, And I always say it's a bad indicator to the extent that people are actually reading that book. It probably means there's something terribly wrong in our politics. And I don't think it's ever gone out of print. I mean, fortunately for me, but unfortunately for politics. As far as I can tell, it's still in print. Um, One of the points I made there that I still very much hold to is that politics has often turned people off by becoming excessively ideological. And I don't mean by that excessively philosophical, because people do bring strong philosophical commitments to politics, and that's a good thing. But ideological politics of a certain kind can be very divisive, where rather than talk about problems, politicians, in order to rally a particular part of the country, talk about issues. And issues often divide us. We have to come together to solve problems. And I have always been taken by Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s view of democracy, where he said that democracy always ought to be about remedy, that the arguments that we have in our politics ultimately should be about solving the problems we have rather than exploiting the problems we have for the purposes of the next election. That's a kind of theme that's run in different ways through a lot of the books I have written. The last book I wrote was called Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. And no one out there who's read me will anyone out there who's read me knows I was very critical of the current president, the president who just went out of office, President Trump. But I also talk in that book about how people who think of themselves as progressive and people who think of themselves as moderate are both committed to public problem solving. They both acknowledge that there is an important role for government to play in dealing with the inequities of capitalism, the way capitalism can go off the rails, and in ending certain injustices. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are two prime examples of where you needed government to intervene to right an injustice. Now, in all of my books, I've always recognized that there has been a Republican Party at moments that was a problem-solving party. The land-grant colleges got created under Abraham Lincoln, one of the great achievements of government. The national parks were expanded massively under Theodore Roosevelt. Dwight Eisenhower created the student loan program that helped me go to college. I've always wanted the Republican Party to rediscover that part of its tradition. I think that part of its tradition has fallen into abeyance, shall we say. I'd like to think that there will be, after this election, and I don't think it may take a couple more elections, there will be some rethinking on the part of at least some Republicans that maybe it's time to rediscover that aspect of republicanism. In the meantime, I do celebrate the problem-solving traditions reflected in JFK and FDR, and I think Joe Biden is picking up on that. A last point I'll make is, if we can't have a problem-solving politics facing this pandemic and the economic downturn we have, we will never have a problem-solving politics in our country. And I'm hoping that at least the depth of our crisis will concentrate our minds on the core purposes of government and pull us at least a bit away from the kinds of divisions that we've had over the last 4 and the last 20 years.
Thank you. Thank you. Tell us about the course you're teaching this term. It's called Policy, Politics in the Media. Can you share with us a few words about the course?
I have taught this course ever since I came to Georgetown. I thought when I started teaching, I said, teach what you know. And I start with teaching what you know. And I obviously, from my sort of what my grad study was in and my work in journalism, said, let me teach about the media. I always tell my students in that class that the development of that class over the last 15 years has traced the radical changes in the media. When I started teaching that class, print newspapers were a big, growing, and profitable concern. We didn't have online outlets the way we have now. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have Facebook. I'm very proud of the following, that some years back, I realized, gee, this online thing matters. I should have a couple of bloggers to my class. And so I invited to that class two 23-year-old bloggers. One of them was called Ezra Klein, and the other was called Ross Douthat. One more liberal, one more conservative. And now Ross and Ezra are both columnists for the New York Times. So I always tell my students, this class tries to stay ahead of the mainstream media. But we talk a lot, increasingly we talk about lying and how the new technologies are magnificent in spreading information, but are also efficient in the spreading of lies. That they are very good at giving people what they want to see, but in the process of giving them what they want to see, they actually can encourage polarization because we only look at what we want to look at. And I have in a lot of guests who work in journalism, have worked in government, have been presidential speechwriters, have worked on the Hill, and I will continue to do that. And just to give you a story about polarization, some years ago, I said, all right, this was back in the days of blogs. And so I said, all right, who reads X blogs? And I listed a number of blogs and that were liberal, and then a bunch of hands went up. And then who reads these blogs? And a bunch of hands went up. And who reads both? And only one hand went up. And I looked at the student, I said, God bless you. You read everybody. And he looked at me and smiled sheepishly and said, well, actually, I have a job at CNN where my job is to read all of the blogs. So he was the only student who read stuff from both sides. And I thought, there's a story about our politics.
Thank you. Thank you. And EJ, thank you for taking this time with us and for all that you do for our community. It's really a privilege to be able to spend this time together. As we close, is there a message you'd like to share with our community as we begin this new semester?
Well, I want to say that one of the things that struck me about teaching online are a couple of things. One is I think we've learned some innovations that I hope we take into the world when it becomes normal. Again, the ability to bring in people and experiences to our students from around the world, that there has been at times, if it works, it can help create a kind of attention and intimacy. And I like to think that professors have tried to be more attentive to students in this period, knowing what they're going through. And I hope we remember to be like that, even when we are not in a period that's not like this. But I also hope that we will appreciate more the ways in which we can be together, the ways in which being present for each other in the same place, in a community, creates connections that we don't fully realize we have until they're gone or taken from us for a while. The last thing I'd like to say is, I do think the last period has reminded us that democracy itself can be very fragile, can come under threat, and that I hope we, watching not just in the US, but around the world, come to appreciate that democracy needs to be treasured. It also needs to be nurtured and defended. And one of the reasons I love teaching at Georgetown, if I may end with an ad for our great institution, is number one, how it teaches tolerance, openness, and pluralism, particularly in the religious sphere. And we are, if you look around at imams, rabbis, ministers, priests, all together engaging with each other, it's a really powerful thing Georgetown does. But also our presence in Washington means that we have an engagement, our students have an engagement with democracy and the fights of democracy. They have big arguments with each other, but also with public life generally. And so I feel very blessed to be in a place that is so closely linked to our nation's history. 1789 is a significant date, and is so intimately linked to the best of our traditions. So thanks for running a very good university, Jack. And I hope I'll be forgiven for this ad that I'm throwing in at the end here.
EJ, thank you. It's wonderful to have this time together with you. And thank you for joining me in this conversation, for sharing your insights with all of us. We are grateful to count you as a member of our community. And I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.